welcome to Inside Events, an international podcast examining contemporary issues in events and ideas across the globe. This week, I'm joined by Professor David McGilivray, and we'll be talking about event bidding. So, David, thanks for joining us on Inside Events. Could you tell us a little bit about who you are and why you're interested in the concept of event bidding?
Of course, Mike. So my name is Professor David McGilivray and I work at University of West of Scotland in the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events, and I have a chair in event and digital cultures. I guess I'm interested in the concept of event bidding because I think over the last few decades we've seen very much an intensification of the number of host cities, but also, of course, host nations bidding to host what we might view as peripatetic or ambulant sporting and cultural events. And I'm interested because, especially on the mega event side of that, there've been so much sought after in terms of these events. So politicians, sporting leaders, business people have thrown a lot of resource, human resource, financial resource, environmental resource at times have been expended to try and secure the rights to host these events in the hope of transforming something, whether that's the urban environment that they're living in, or perhaps even the national image of the country that's been bidding. And so I think bidding is a crucial part of that whole mega event, in particular life cycle or project, and it's where competition actually is at its most intense, and also where commitments that are made at that very early point in a process become a really significant financial reality, in particular several years later. So that's why I'm interested in the event bidding concept.
And in terms of the kind of concept in question, is there a way that you could, just for the listeners out there, could you break down the concept in a little bit of detail just to kind of help us understand this concept of event bidding?
Of course. So I think the concept of event bidding really is reflected in the process whereby prospective cities, regions, countries, or even more recently a number of countries collectively might bid to host, as I said, an ambulant sporting or cultural event. So something that's on a cycle. You bid for every 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 years this event happens. And when we talk about event bidding, I think I'm primarily interested in the competition that takes place between candidate cities and or countries, whereby each responds to a call, and it's a call that's put out there by a sporting or a cultural organization that owns the event in question, so the event franchise, if you like, and is looking to have someone to host it every 2, 3, or 4 years to kind of make that the most attractive event for the event owner, or actually even to make most money for that particular event owner. Because what we know about event bidding is that the event owner sees this as one of their major assets in terms of being able to bring in money. And in terms of what the perspective might be, that's set out by this event owner. So they will set out the technical requirements that they want this person or this organization or city that's going to be hosting their event, in 7 years' time. They set out what that prospectus is. So that will include, what kind of venues you need to have, what kind of sporting schedule you need to apply to adhere to, what kind of cultural program might need to go around about the event, what legacy vision is there for not just the city that's hosting or the country that's hosting, but also for the event owner that wishes to project its event out there too. So in doing so, they then open up to a series of what we might call candidate cities or hosts that then pull together their perspective. So then you've got this other side of this process where the potential host pulls together a prospectus as to what they will do to deliver on those requirements, whilst of course generating the most revenue for the awarding body in the process and or producing the most attractive event for spectators, but also for media audiences, which have become a bigger part of these events. So while event bidding processes have definitely changed in more recent years, as the main sport and event awarding bodies have been kind of tarnished, I think, by some of the kind of controversies that have happened over recent years, especially the Olympic Games, a good example. The competitive process for these highly sought after events made this, I think, an intriguing concept to study and still does for many people. So event bidding has been both professionalized, but I think also politicized with the entry of experts, consultants, for example, to support bidding processes, but also political actors, really kind of giving backing to national bids or to city bids, and awarding bodies also being heavily criticized in recent years for the bids that appear to have gone against their own stated values and principles because of the financial return that they wish to secure from these events. So the concept is that movability. There's these ambulant events. You've got awarding bodies on one side, you've got hosts, a prospective host on the other, and they're in this kind of real competition, fight, battle to secure the rights. So that's again a summary of the event bidding concept.
And I think it's in terms of why people should care about this concept, it becomes obviously kind of very clear from what you just said. But if you could encapsulate that maybe in kind of a minute or two, David.
Yeah, I think we should be interested because they are massively financial outlays to bid for an event, and that's something that has an impact for years to come. So they're not temporary; they can live long term. Whether you're successful, and in terms of the commitments you are then tied into, or whether even you're unsuccessful, but you may be along a development pathway that the event bid represented the start of. So they're important for those reasons because they have significant impact. So event bids that also commit to hosting have to honour that perspective down the line. So there's contractual power built into that. So the resources that you have to put out there to deliver on an event can be significant. And we know that down the line, often these have been way over what people had imagined. And actually that comes from the event process. And it comes from a weakness in the event process in more recent years where so many people have been outbidding each other that they've overcommitted to delivering these most spectacular events at that very early stage when people aren't even that aware of what they're committing to. I mean, the public haven't been so aware of what they're committing to. And I think it's also been the environment where we know event bidding's important to listeners because of the kind of corruption, the subterfuge, the politicking that goes on in and around these events. So if we want mega events to be, I don't know, more ethical things, then we need to make sure that the event bidding process is also more transparent at a much earlier stage. And I guess maybe the last thing I would say just about why it's important is that it is the point at which most leverage exists for for the awarding body to get the most out of what they want from the event, but actually I think more crucially for nations and host cities to be really aware of what they're actually committing to and actually the values they're adhering to. So the best example I think of that is human rights increasingly now embedded in the bidding process in some way, so that actually we don't end up with some of the really worst excesses of infringements of human rights that we've seen in previous mega events, where that wasn't the case at the event bidding process.
That's really interesting. And obviously kind of the rights and social responsibilities is becoming increasingly more prominent as critical commentators, academics all around the world are applying pressure alongside the public as well. So that's obviously kind of causing this kind of evolution of the bidding process year on year. It seems like the criteria is changing, the kind of considerations that people have to think about in terms of event bidding is changing. How would you say that the concept of event bidding has evolved over the past kind of decade, for example?
Well, I think we've moved from a point of position where very competitive bid processes were the norm. Many potential hosts bidding against many other potential hosts, all expending significant resources with only one winner in that process. The real winner was the awarding body, because people competing to make the most gargantuan mega event possible that also generates the most revenue for the mega event awarding body. That's actually, I think, changing and has changed partly because of the situation that you mentioned a moment ago, which is the opposition groups, whether they be civil society groups, NGOs, a range of actors, joining this kind of space and saying, you know what, enough is enough. We're spending too much on these events. They're costing too much. There's corruption. There's real issues with the awarding body. Human rights are being infringed. We must not continue to bid for these. And we've seen, in particular in democratic contexts, a number of host cities and a number of host countries shying away from bidding for Olympic Games, for example, or even the FIFA World Cup to an extent, because the public has become aware of the costs. And there have been referendum in a number of places saying, no, actually, we're not going to bid because the costs are too high. And of course, that's opened up another change, which has meant that states that perhaps have less democratic accountability in terms of politicians or leaders are, of course, able to enter that space, promise the world, deliver on all the financial, venue, other infrastructure claims at the bid process, and actually become the candidate cities and eventually the hosts of some of these events. So
that's been another major change, which has kind of opened it up. And if we're looking at it in a geopolitical context, some would argue, well, that's good. Other nations can bid. It's not just the, I don't know, the liberal democracies of the West, but of course, they also brings with it lots of criticism around about what type of nations have been bidding for these events. And as I said, some of these, in particular, the human rights infringements that have come alongside that. And that's now changed in the sense that I think for the Olympic Games, for the FIFA World Cup, things like human rights, environmental sustainability are really embedded in the process now, so that you could imagine that at that process there is less likelihood that a kind of really rogue bid would progress through. And we're just seeing that in recent times. Saudi Arabia looking to potentially bid for the 2032 FIFA World Cup. Already there are major kind of criticisms coming from human rights bodies saying, FIFA, you cannot award a World Cup to a nation that doesn't adhere to human rights in the way that we set out in your human rights policy. And that's the kind of starting gun, I guess, on some of these kind of really hotly contested debates we're going to see in the next few years too. I think also a trend is that we're seeing almost the removal of this kind of, I was going to say blind candidate cities, but candidate cities all competing against each other and expending a lot of resource with no hope of securing victory, if you like. I think we're now seeing awarding bodies more in conversations with potential hosts at a much earlier stage without commitment. And in fact, without financial commitment on behalf of the host to have to kind of really expend significant amounts before they even get to the kind of first stage. And what's also happening there is for events outside of mega sporting events, so smaller events, but quite significant events, are quite regularly now almost forming an agreement with a host city that they believe can deliver their event for them. Two good examples that I would just give you in 2023. Glasgow's hosting the UCI World Cycling Championships, where 13 events are pulled together in one. Discussed an agreement with Glasgow. The Rotterdam's hosting the European Para Sport Championships. Again, lots of para events being brought into one and engaged with one host city in that process. I think we're going to find much more. There's going to be an alignment without a costly bidding process on both sides.
And I think that, you were talking there about a lot of the kind of key trends and impacts that are kind of affecting the bidding process. The fact that the model's completely changing in lots of different ways. We've got the Middle East that are thinking about bidding, all of which have kind of completely different social issues, economic issues that vary so wildly from the kind of the Western democracies that have been beforehand. What do you think the key future trends are for event bidding that we need to be aware of, David?
I mean, I think you've touched on certainly, one of them I think is absolutely about increased pressure on awarding bodies. I think there's a much greater recognition that awarding bodies have responsibility for the events that they are looking to, loan out there to kind of hire out for as a franchise for others to deliver upon, and down the line once they come to deliver, that they have responsibility within their event for what happens in each of the host nations or cities that end up hosting these events. And I think that's fundamentally changed bidding process too, because as I said earlier, NGOs, civil society organizations, bodies across the world are kind of really holding the kind of feet to the fire, awarding bodies, saying you cannot do this. You've got these very clear statements now, like very clear statements in terms of policy and otherwise around about a range of kind of human rights and environmental sustainability in particular related angles. So you can't simply take those policies and then when it comes to a bid coming in from someone that's offering you more money, just award it to those without there being any additional scrutiny. And we, I think, know that there's been a good example is when Qatar won the World Cup several years before, really lots of corruption allegations within that process. I think actually FIFA, I'm sure reflecting back would realize that actually this was really disastrous for the brand FIFA because they had to constantly respond to kind of claims that they didn't follow their own policy. So I think that is certainly, I think, a very good development that I think a range of actors are coming together collectively actually to say you can't do this anymore. We can see it. It's visible. It's transparent. We can see what's happening, and that's putting a lot of pressure on that bidding process. I think we're obviously still going to see democratic nations in particular considering whether the costs and the implications are going to be worth it in terms of the amount of money they have to put out there and commit to a bidding process. And I think that's going to continue. I think we're finding, as you said, several new players very desperate to enter the sport mega event landscape and marketplace. Saudi Arabia, I think, is one very, very good example, looking to extend kind of soft power moves across the world. And I think that's something that we're going to see continuing, because still, even although there have been changes to the event bidding process and what you have to commit to, they're still gargantuan projects. These are not now very small scale projects. They're still gargantuan for most nations to consider. I think we will see more transparency in the process, as I mentioned. I think we're also going to see in the event bidding process that kind of trend towards more multiple host city nation bids coming in. We've seen that in recent years. Difficult to assess whether these are successful or not. I think there's still some dubiety as to whether that is successful, but I think we will see that where there will be multiple bids. I mean, United 2026 FIFA World Cup, good example, Mexico, the United States and Canada bid for that event. It's going to be a massive scale to manage in terms of event, but certainly that I think is going to be a trend. And I think especially that will happen, people will bid for events that have significant media coverage. And I think that's, again, one of the other things I think we're really beginning to see is people thinking about where there are massive TV audiences, then actually the kind of ability, the scale of the event itself isn't the major consideration. It's actually where can we reach by bidding for a sport event that's available. So it might not be the sort of event that people want to attend in massive numbers in a host city, but people are bidding for events that they know will reach out to, for example, a massive European audience. Glasgow hosted the 2018 European Sport Championships, knowing that it was a massive audience in Europe for the sports that were part of that event. Not necessarily massive, spectator numbers in the city itself. And I think that's kind of interesting trend too. So I think these are some of the trends that we're likely to be see over the next few years, Mike.
Thanks, David. And in terms of kind of new countries that are bidding for these large scale major events, it's a bit of a party every day in Saudi Arabia at the moment. Like, there's so much going on in these particular new nations. Do you think that it will lead to kind of some sort of lasting, sustainable change, or do you think that they're kind of just one-off projects and bids that won't lead to much change? Do you think that they're putting enough structures in place?
Well, I don't think that they're in any way one-off, and I think that's kind of maybe the thing that I think we found difficult to really assess in the West when we look at Saudi. I think this is the 2030 vision that Saudi has, economic vision for changing that particular nation, being less dependent on fossil fuels and oil and gas production. And I think they've been very, very, very deliberate in their strategies. It's caused huge amount of disruption to existing models, sport sponsorship, sport investment, etc. But absolutely, and similarly, applying for attracting, hosting events. I think the challenge you've got with a nation like Saudi now is once it reaches the very highest level events, like the high order events, top tier, World Cup, Olympic Games, that's when scrutiny goes to another level, which then brings forth a whole series of debates about the values of, for example, the Olympic movement and whether these are aligned through the Olympic Charter with the activities of the Saudi state, for example. So I think similarly to Qatar bid for, if we think about event bidding, bid for many sport events in the lead up to its World Cup and beyond, and then bid and hosted many events before it hosted the World Cup. So in terms of the ability to host and to put on a wonderful spectacle and to invest in the best facilities and provide a welcome to visiting spectators, etc. These nations were really quite well versed in that. So it wasn't like there was an issue, for example, in Qatar about hosting in general. There were issues arose around about issues associated with LGBTQI communities and some of the religious dimensions and the impact of those on kind of particular laws in each country. And that will be the same in Saudi. But these are by no means one-off strategy. These are very deliberate, I think. And I think that we will find that the kind of opening up, the kind of liberalization will be, whether meaningful and really and long-standing, it will absolutely happen in the lead up to bidding for one of these major events. And that's a real threat, I think, to other potential hosts in the West and beyond, because they simply won't be able to compete with the level and scale of the kind of investment and the kind of wonderful perspectives that will be pushed out there. And then we're back into a debate about awarding bodies, actually, as to whether they've moved on sufficiently to say it's unacceptable to award a games or an event like this to a nation that has such a challenging set of human rights kind of histories and present, when they have moved very, quite far towards human rights being really quite effectively embedded within their own organizational structures. So it's a real test, I think.
That's brilliant. Thanks, David. To be honest, we could talk for quite some time about this, but to finish off, are there any kind of particular resources, reports, any other material that you would direct people to in order to find out a little bit more about this event bidding topic?
Well, obviously, I would point you towards a really excellent event bidding book, which I've authored with my colleague Daniel Turner, which is about politics, persuasion, resistance, and around about bidding. So, really focuses a lot on sport mega events. There are, I think, a growing number of articles that are looking at the process of event bidding and particular case studies of event bidding with events across the world. And I think these are available in most of our best sport management journals, I think, but also in event journals like Event Management, of course. And I think the kind of last thing I would point to is some of these are what some of the kind of civil society or independent sport organizations like the Sport and Rights Alliance or the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, to look at actually the really excellent documentation they've been developing, sometimes in and alongside awarding bodies and host governments and sporting federations, to ensure that the event bidding process is more transparent, is more accountable, and is thinking about the kind of large issues in the world around about sustainability, around about human rights. Because I think these are a kind of trend that I didn't really mention, but these are where, rather than always being oppositional and outside of the tent, you're finding a range of coalition partners coming together to try and work to lobby and advocate with the awarding bodies. And I think that's something that will be hopefully really progressive as we move into the kind of next phase of mega event bidding in particular.
That's super. Thanks, David. Thank you so much for coming on Inside Events. We'll put a link underneath the video cast to the book because it's a brilliant book. I use it in my class all the time. But thanks once again. I'm going to give you a clap because I've got like a little media thing here. I don't know whether you. It's very cheesy. Thanks a lot for coming, and see you on Inside Events next time.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Super. Thanks, David. That was really good. Really interesting. To be honest,